Well, Neal, welcome. It's a real pleasure. Of course, we used to do an interview segment on KUAC years ago, so this is like old school for me, and I'm really relishing this opportunity. But stuff I didn't know about you. Your family has been in farming for generations, and one of your ancestors got a parcel of land through the Mexican-American War. Tell me about that.
Well, he lived in near St. Louis, Missouri, but over in the Illinois section with his father and family. And he was poor. And so an opportunity arose to go fight in the Mexican-American War. If you spent a year there, you could get what was called a bounty land warrant for 50 acres, and that's what he did. So he was down there for a year. He supposedly was around Santa Ana in the opposition during that war for a while. And then he came back, homesteaded there in Bond County, Illinois. But in the crop failures and the bank failures of 1870s or so, he packed up his whole family. Many of his daughters were married to people from the Civil War that had fought in the Civil War. And they all got in a wagon train. I think they rode alongside the railroad tracks as they went west.
Yeah.
And they ended up in northeast of Walla Walla, Washington, in the southeastern corner. So they homesteaded there. And that's where I was born and raised as an only child on a farm. And so I escaped because of interest in amateur radio, photography, electronics, and so I didn't stay with the farm, but I did go into those studies.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about that because you're known as a hands-on scientist. You're comfortable building and fiddling with and getting pieces of equipment to actually work that may be dusty up in the attic of the GI and get it burnished and going. So was that gained from that farming community? Did you have to be a hands-on kind of person?
Everything was targeting on harvest. So you spent a lot of time preparing all your equipment to make sure it was ready to go by the end of July, early August farming, because you just really couldn't run into town and buy a spare part. So you did everything you could, and a lot of the things you did, you had to make do to get from here to there. So it wasn't running into town, but how can I jury rig this thing to keep on going?
MacGyver it.
Yeah, and so I think that followed me into my, not only in my scientific career, but 30 miles out of Fairbanks is Poker Flat Research Range, and I became the first full-time person there in August of 1971. And again, you just didn't run back into town to find something to keep on going. But you did everything you could prepare to get up for a rocket launch at a given time frame, and seemed to work.
Yeah, it did. But you talk about your early passion about radio. You got that through your uncle, I understand.
He did.
Yeah.
My uncle was very interested in radios in the days of batteries and big old tubes that glowed, and he listened to worldwide radios. And he sparked my interest in it, and he also sparked my interest in science fiction. So between him and the radios, I got all sorts of old radios to take apart, learn how they work, and also got inspired by the John Carter of Mars. Like there's 11 small books that really inspired me. So I have to look back to think my uncle did a great job there. He, in truth, was an alcoholic, and he didn't farm. But my dad and he both bought adjoining land, about 220 acres apiece. And so my dad took over farming both pieces of land, and that made a profit for my family as well as his family. And he had children that were much older than myself. I grew up without any neighborhood friends nearby, which led to my folks getting me involved in Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts and
And
so
you
on
were
and so
quite
forth.
accomplished as a scout.
I ended up with the Eagle Award, which is the highest award you can get in Boy Scouts. And then I don't even think it exists today, but there's a follow-on program called Explorer Scouts. So I basically got the Silver Award for that, which is the equivalent of the eagle. You did it again. But by and large, we as a group of scouts were far more interested in hiking and camping in the Cascade Mountains in the state of Washington than we were in earning merit badges. So, yeah.
Well, and I want to point out that when you went to high school, there was some question which track you would go on to, because there was so much farming in that area. There's a farmer's track, and Pullman has a university there too.
That's true.
College, and so there's also a college track, and there was some debate early on which track you'd go.
Well, one of the great embarrassments in my life that I overcame was when I came home from the opening day of high school with a list of the courses that I was scheduled to take. My mother went ballistic because these were all like Farmers Association of America and soil conservation and all sorts of things. And she just jumped in the car, had me sit beside her, and we drove back to the high school, and we challenged, and instead of being in the farm-related then set of curriculum, I was transferred over into just a high school curriculum that would lead towards college, because many of the kids in Pullman High School were all children of faculty at the Washington State College, as it was called then. And that's where I graduated in physics in 1961 from, and it changed its name that year to Washington State University.
And I can't let you leave your high school without mentioning you were an accomplished trombonist.
I love playing the trombone. I was encouraged. I look back on it as one of the things that I failed to do was to carry on with it. I have a brand new trombone sitting in the basement at home, and all sorts of intentions to pick it up and start playing again, because I really, really enjoyed it. And I got high marks for doing it and encouragement in many ways, but I just didn't have the time. And as I started out in electrical engineering and then switched over into physics, I just found it hard to continue that, even though I love music and still listen to wonderful trombone music. And here on this campus at the University of Alaska, we have just a really outstanding trombonists and teachers.
Yeah. And when you went into college, of course, you went in, and as you mentioned, physics was a main passion. Was there a branch of physics that really caught your passion?
You know, we didn't really have much of a focus there. It was undergraduate. There were the classes that I really got the most interest out of were the hands-on classes. So we had to make and demonstrate something to our classmates, if you will. And Scientific American always had an article in the rear of it, the amateur scientist. And I took the Scientific American for many, many years. And so I did several experiments, made a magnetic resonance imaging type device, showed you how it worked. And of course, it's in common use today. When you have a medical problem, you can go do MRIs. Others involved color vision. Some of it involved high vacuum work with pumps to create the conditions of nearly outer space and that sort of thing. So I had a lot of fun with those, and I had a mentor there, a really fine gentleman that Dr. Paul Bender. He made a huge difference in my life because he really supported my interest in hands-on things. I wasn't a great student. I kind of barely scraped through with C pluses and a few B minuses, but it really, the emphasis on mathematical physics there stood me in good stead when I got here to the University of Alaska at the Geophysical Institute to study the Aurora Borealis, which I got to by way of working for NASA for a year in California.
Well, I was going to say,
graduation.
You sort of poo-poo your physics career at the college, but NASA went looking for you.
Yeah.
You didn't go to it. Tell me how that worked.
Well, I'll tell you two stories. One is out of the blue. I did an interview with NASA. I interviewed with some other major players that came looking for talent at the Washington State, and instead I got this telegram saying, "We want you." And I, of course, said, "Heck yes." And it was kind of vindication of my father and mother, who they understood electrical engineers. And when I changed over to physics, I said, "Well, you're just going to be one of those eggheads that does nothing but teach other eggheads." But with NASA interested in having me, they realized there was probably more going on. So I got the NASA Ames Research Center in Southern California, or in the Bay Area, California. And I walked in, and it turned out I was one of 50 people that were hired at each of the NASA centers throughout the United States. The sense was we were falling behind with the space program. We were committed to putting a man on the moon.
Yeah, this is the Mercury project
and
times.
all of them. And at that point, we had put satellites into orbit, but they all burned up on reentry. So here we were in 1961, committed to going to the moon, which we did by 1968, and we didn't have the hardware to do it and survive it. So my time at NASA Ames was spent building a test chamber equivalent to the reentry heating that happens in the atmosphere. And you and I see this often when we see a meteorite burn up in the atmosphere, a meteoroid burn up in the atmosphere. And doing that led to my interest in the Aurora Borealis, because it's there at the same altitude. You can study the aurora, ascertain temperatures, pressures, chemical compositions in the atmosphere, all those things just from looking at the light of the aurora and breaking it down with a spectroscope. And so I was fascinated with that. And that led to my very much an interest to get into the aurora in a greater way. Working at NASA, I spent every penny that I earned. I was always hiking and camping in the Sierra or on the beaches in California. But I had a friend that spent a year in Thule, Greenland. Thule, Greenland year commitment got me $20,000 on room and board and the equivalent rating of being a major in the Air Force on a civilian project. I was one of 3 people. Too good a deal to pass up, so when I ended my year in Greenland, I got in my pickup truck and came to Fairbanks, Alaska, and it was through people in Alaska on ham radio that I realized— John Miller. I realized how this would be the perfect place for me to be, and it's got here and I've never left.
Whoa, wait a minute here, Neal. The way I hear tell when you talk to me is you were expecting to come up to Alaska and have mountains and glaciers right next door.
Wow.
And so you were a little disabused of that expectation.
It was sad to come across the Canadian border into the Tanana Valley and see the mountains way off to the south, 90 miles away, and think that it's going to be harder than I thought. And then to also find out there really aren't any trails around in those mountains. It's all rough country traveling, which is marvelous to do, but a little different level than hiking around the Cascade Mountains on established trails. But yeah, I was disappointed. I thought, well, I'll give it 3 years. I'll get my master's degree, and then I'm out of here. Of course, then I got married within the first year that I was in Alaska, and thought, well, we'll hang on, we'll see what we do. Like I say,
This is the early 60s. Was
Right.
Keith Mather ahead of the GI then?
Yes, he was.
Yeah, what was he like?
He was an amazing person who saw through any flaws I guess I had. But I had taken Toastmasters when I was working at NASA Ames. It's not a class you paid for, but I found it really worked. It sort of fit in with my amateur radio, being able to communicate type. And so when I got here, all of a sudden Keith was asking me to organize the seminars, one each week, go around and find Geophysical Institute scientists who would be willing to give talks. And of course we'd have people visiting from outside of Alaska, and he would introduce me to them, and I would write the little posters and introduce them and sort of work through the questions and answer periods after. So he saw that in me, and he and Neal Davis, who soon came in as the acting or the assistant director, to Keith. I had a great relationship with both of them.
Yeah. Now, when you first came up here, were you working on spectroscopy? Is that right?
Yeah.
Tell me what that is and what fascinated you about that.
Well, I think we've all seen the cute little triangular pieces of glass that you can hang in the sun and break the light into the various colors, the spectrum of colors.
Like a prism.
Prism. So that was pretty much already accomplished for the visible light of the aurora with all sorts of equipment in the past, but an area that had not been accessible was the so-called near infrared. And there were no films that would work, and there were some electronic devices, but you had to cool them down to the temperature of liquid nitrogen for them to even halfway work. And I thought, this is duck soup. With all my electronics background and everything, I can do this. So my master's thesis was the near-infrared emissions of the aurora, which are just beyond the red of the visible that you and I see, and go out about doubling the spectrum. And usually involves molecules of oxygen and molecules of nitrogen and a few other things. So that was what my focus was, and when I did accomplish my master's degree, my thesis advisor, Dr. Al Balon, learned for the first time that I'm colorblind, and he said, "Well, how did you aim your instrumentation for that?"
Ixnay there, yeah.
So it was kind of fun, but anyway, he and my committee said they wanted me to go for a PhD. Big surprise. I was in it for the master's, not a PhD. At the same time, Roger Sheridan was the head of the physics department, and he immediately said, "We'd really like you to teach." This was '66 that I got my master's degree. That fall, he wanted me to teach physics for non-science majors, 103, 104 here on campus.
I want to come back in the teaching side of thing in a minute.
Sure.
But I want to revisit this issue about the aurora because, interestingly enough, over your career, it would arise time and time again. And of course, when you became director of the Poker Flat Research Range, it would be a dominant target for many of those launches. So the aurora at this point wasn't well known. How well known was the physics behind the aurora when you first came up here?
I saw aurora as a kid and didn't pay any attention to them. Didn't see any particular connection to do anything science-wise with it. And when I was at NASA Ames, that made the connection. Re-entry heating, we don't know as much about the atmosphere as we really should know to understand how to launch rockets and how to deal with effects of space weather and things like that on the Earth. So that's how I kind of got in there and followed my nose and or my eyes or my brain. I don't know. I'm inherently curious about stuff.
Sure.
So that's what led. But one other thing that happened while I was at NASA Ames, I went into a bookstore called Tepler's, which still exists today. And here was a book about everything that had been learned about the aurora during the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58. It was a summary called Aurora and Air Glow, and I read that from cover to cover, and that's how I got really interested. And it turned out, as I thought, I would help solve the reentry physics problem into the atmosphere by studying the aurora, and that would help NASA finally build the hardware they needed. They went on without me, but and built other hardware. But still, I felt like I was in that groove to add to this. And of course, any scientist that starts off interested in something finds more reasons to study it. The aurora, in addition, is so incredibly beautiful. It just is fascinating. So I was in on the ground floor, experiments to try to understand how the electrons that rain in from outer space that are sent here by storms from the sun, how they exchange their energy with the atmosphere, create electric and magnetic fields, disrupt radio waves. These were all kind of hot topics. There were issues that people had worked on, but they weren't solved yet when I got here.
But when you first came up here, what was known about the Aurora? How well known or understood was it?
Well, it was undergoing some major knowledge accumulations through Shin Agasafu, who was the first one to really figure out the worldwide impact of how these auroras were completely encircling both the northern and southern hemisphere, and you'd have these explosions, so-called substorms. And that was a major impact. And Neal Davis, who was here, he worked very hard on the magnetic disturbances that he saw, and he ended up creating an index that's in use today that parlays, puts together all of the magnetic records and then gives you a sense of how powerful these storms are. Shin's taken it more recently, probably 20 years ago now, into predicting how the storms will happen. So that didn't exist. We were always asked back in the 60s, will there be Aurora tonight? And we had no way of helping anybody understand it beyond the general idea that they peak every 11 years, that when you have a storm on the sun, it might last 3 or 4 months. And the sun turns on its axis to aim the same part of the sun at the earth every 27 days. So between those, we could say something, but we really couldn't see what was happening until we put a satellite in a tug-of-war position between the earth and the sun. And that was probably in the late 80s that we suddenly had something sitting there that gave us about a 4-hour warning. So there were lots of open pieces. What we knew, of course, was the basics of the sun as the source. The Earth is a planet that has a magnetic field which organizes that storm into the subpolar regions, and we knew the Earth has an atmosphere, so these are like neon sign type electron impacts, and the colors of the aurora are the colors of the gases in the Earth's atmosphere that are glowing after the impact. That we knew.
Well, and I want to point out that you were part of an experiment that finally sort of answered whether when these particles come from the sun and engage our magnetic magnetosphere, the southern pole happens at the same time as the northern pole. Tell me about that experiment and how you guys managed to solve that issue.
Long interest of the Geophysical Institute for a decade or more about how to do this, and we're talking about 1967 now, February, March 1967. But they attempted to put a camera at Kotzebue on the ground, another one at Macquarie Island in the southern hemisphere. They were always frustrated by weather, by these film cameras, timing, the generators that ran erratically, and the film didn't pull regularly, and on and on. 11 years of that. There came a time, though, leading into 1967, where the National Science Foundation really wanted to support something like this, and they found a partner with airplanes, and that was the Atomic Energy Commission. They had Snooper airplanes. They were fully manned Boeing 4-engine jets that were instrumented to snoop on other countries doing nuclear weapons tests. And they didn't have a lot to do with them at the moment because nobody was doing that anymore. And NASA had just created the first advanced technology satellite that would allow you to communicate from any place on the Earth to another via that satellite. So NSF, for $25,000 to the Geophysical Institute, put Al Balon, who was heading the project, Neal Davis played a big part of it, and Keith Mather and Gene Westcott. They all were really pushing on this, and I was one of the cannon fodder graduate students. You know?
Yeah, let them go up in the plane.
So Eldon Thompson, who became a good friend at poker in the later years, he went on the Southern airplane. I went on the Northern airplane. We went down to Albuquerque, New Mexico, instrumented the airplanes with simple 35 millimeter all-sky cameras. Then we flew off to Hawaii to learn how to surf, which isn't a great place to learn how to surf at Waikiki. The waves are about that big. But anyway,
that's a perfect place to start.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Yeah.
But anyway, then he went south and I went north. And we flew from Anchorage out of Elmendorf Air Force Base south to Kodiak, back up to Kaktovik and back. And the Southern airplane flew out of Christchurch, New Zealand, and went south and came back north. The conjugate, that is where the magnetic field line over Fairbanks, Alaska, intercepts the one about 750 miles south of Christchurch, New Zealand. That's the conjugate point. First pictures we took, as soon as we hit the ground, we mailed the film into the Geophysical Institute here in Fairbanks. A couple days later, we would fly a mission, and then we had to take a rest because they were really long flights up and back. And we got word that we aced it. It was perfect. So that project went on. We did film cameras in all sky in '67, color film, '68, televisions in '68, on and on. Ultimately, we led to that the auroras were conjugate, identical to one another within 2 seconds. The aurora in one hemisphere would brighten, the other one brighten. The aurora would move a little bit, the other one would move a little bit. And years later, we confirmed that with Dr. Tom Hallinan and Dr. Winkler of John Winkler of Minnesota, when we launched rockets out of poker that fired electron beams that would create a pencil-like beam of aurora in the southern hemisphere and bounce back up and create the same kind of little beam in the northern hemisphere. So it was an amazing, probably the most important thing that I think I ever got involved with, because we had written all sorts of, I hadn't, but people had written that this was how they thought Mother Nature worked. And we figured it out.
And
really
you were part
did
of the team
work.
that
And I was a
figured
part
it
of
out.
that team.
How exciting. Well, before we go to Poker Flat, which you became the director of, I just want to observe that one of the wonderful things about the Geophysical Institute and the university here is at this time when you're a grad student and taking on all these assignments, really was a hands-on, almost adventurous period of research here.
Yeah.
Is that how it strikes you?
It was, and I have to say I don't think it's quite the same anymore, but everybody, I was building my own equipment, I was assembling it, I was working nights to look at the aurora, and sort of carried that right on into the time at poker. As I was working out there, I was also doing little experiments here and there on the aurora, and it was all hands-on. As time went by, and probably another 15, 20 years later, most graduate students today are handed data from satellites, and they're to analyze it, but they aren't doing all-night observing out in the pucker brush of Alaska.
And we'll let them decide whether that's a gain or a loss to them. Talking about the aurora, you, Dan Osborne, Tom Hallinan got together and for the first time managed to capture the aurora in really vivid colors.
Right. NHK, which is a group in Japan, they decided they wanted to honor Frank Yashuda, who had been a cabin boy, trapped in the ice, got the Barrow, saved everybody's lives aboard the ship, lived in Barrow, married, took half of Barrow when they were under a problem of not enough food, down and created Beaver Village on the Yukon River. So NHK wanted to honor him by creating a video of the aurora, and they set about to do it. they kept bringing a camera up here and comparing it to our ability to take videos of the aurora, and kept not really doing too well. They finally, about 7 years of this, of visits, they got it up to the point it would register aurora in color, but not great. And as a reward to us, they sold us an identical camera. They had millions invested in this camera. They never did anything more with it after they did that program that appeared only in Japan. So we had a duplicate of that camera. We got $100,000, $50,000 from NASA, $50,000 from NSF. We bought 2 3/4-inch tape recorders, $25,000 a piece, and the camera for $50,000 from Japan. And we had it here with no money to operate it for about a year, and we didn't really get anything done. I was still the director out at Poker. I set aside a 5-foot dome. Tom Hallinan and Dan Osborne were electronics experts. I had a background in electronics, but they had good color vision and I don't. So between the three of us, we put together the Aurora Color Television Project, and throughout the spring of '85, we got incredible footage that we turned in to the Geophysical Institute Advisory Committee, who said, you need to copyright this artistically in your names. It's scientific data. Anybody can use it as a scientist. But you need to copyright it in your names, because if the university gets hold of it, they will somehow run it around, and it won't come out well in the long run for the benefit of everyone. So we did, and the first video we reproduced was called Aurora. We used the funding that we got from selling those tapes to create the Aurora Explained, and those we never did get around to turning them to DVDs. But during their heydays, so from the '85 through about '95, they were the highest quality color video of the Aurora available to the general public, and we sold like 80,000 copies.
And isn't it ironic today that your phone probably takes as good images of the aurora? Because I know
It is.
you're an avid photographer.
Yeah, it is. Not only will the cell phone take a picture, a decent picture, it won't take a decent video, but it will take a decent picture. But I have a camera that is around $2,400, off the shelf Sony A7S, ISO 51,200. I go outside of my house with a fairly good lens on it that costs another $400 or $500, and I can take video that is automatically color registered of the aurora, and I post them on my Vimeo.com account for anybody to look at, download, and see. I'm glad to share them with anybody. I'm not making any money off of this stuff, but it still shares my fascination with the aurora.
Well, I'm going to go then now to Poker Flat, which you became the director of. And in his book, Rockets Over Alaska, Neal Davis writes about you that you were a talented experimental scientist and manager of people.
Yeah.
And that project really demanded both of those, because you would have probably cranky, hands-on engineering type and more, ethereal, theoretical types to cope with.
So I learned to be a conductor, like my music days with the trombone. Everybody there knew all about rockets that worked for me. I didn't. I knew about the science. I knew about the aurora. I knew why we were there. I knew what we wanted to set up to do and be prepared for it when the time we're supposed to be prepared for it. But I found myself in the position of really enjoying being a leader, and I had no experience at that, but the people that were there helped me learn how to do it successfully, and we had a really good relationship through the years. The Geophysical Institute had similar staffing in the Geophysical and Business Office, in the machine shop. There were small groups that were just really dedicated to meeting the mark, getting things done the way well, and doing them right. So that's part of that story of being a leader. Now, Cranky, yes, but most of those, they weren't the rocket scientists because I had a real rapport with the scientists. They had a job to do, and I didn't have any trouble. They liked me, and I liked them because I was really interested in being on the cutting edge, and I would ask them lots of questions. Did a lot of public relations work talking to the media in Fairbanks and elsewhere about the rockets being launched from Poker. The people who were a little painful to deal with at times were the engineers from outside of Alaska who would come up here and try to keep their rocket warm and try to fabricate this and that. And they didn't always listen to us because we had developed the knowledge of how to do it safely. We made sure we didn't have any static electricity around because that could set off a rocket. We knew how to keep things warm. We developed the expertise, but in the first 3 years, it was kind of a little knockdown, drag out with some of the engineers that worked for NASA and worked for other people that came in. But I also want to make sure that I say NASA Wallops was the group that led the rocketry programs, and they were a can-do outfit. Everything I learned the right way, I learned from NASA Wallops. And then that adapted that with the crew that was at Poker. And John Benevento here at the community of Fairbanks, he was part of NASA Wallops, and he's lived now in Fairbanks for a long time, very active member of the community. So there were a lot of good people involved.
Well, let me observe that Poker Flat Research Range is the only, I believe, still,
Right.
only rocket range owned by a university, and that the university here is a land, sea, and space grant institution. Right. And you, at one point, directed the space grant part of it, and we'll get to that point. But paint us a picture, Neal, of what those early days of rocketry were like.
It was kind of a crazy Alaska homesteader organization. We did everything ourselves out there. We really didn't hire any contractors to build the facilities. And so when something came at us, we tried to figure out how to do it with what we had. They called it a Chinese fire drill. Everybody was kind of running around in circles. We had amazingly antiquated equipment. We did amazing things, worked super long hours. Every time we weren't waiting for hours to launch rockets, we were trying to build something to make it better. I had two people, direct contrast. Carol Coe was superb, explosive expert from the Air Force, and he was a launch controller. He launched all the rockets. He pushed the button. Never had any safety issues with him. He enjoyed being in the blockhouse. He could tell great stories and so on. Eldon Thompson was the guy who could build anything out of anything. He was just an amazing guy. So you want a building, you want a launcher cover, you want a mechanism, tell Eldon, and he would get the whole crew to do that. Hated sitting in the blockhouse, yammering with a bunch of people waiting for the rocket to get off the ground. They were just like always gently fighting with one another, who was going to control the crew now for what. So I had no problem with that, but I liked them both. They were really, really great. But we ended up building buildings. We had this gigantic A-frame at Poker Flat that was built in for the first launches.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that within a few months of your becoming the director, there's a picture of it exploding intentionally.
Right. So they built this gigantic building, insulated it, put it on railroad tracks, and they were going to drag it back and forth over permafrost-filled ground to be ready to launch within 20 minutes. Never really worked well at all. Within a year or so, the rails had kind of shifted around. And so we were looking to build other ways to enclose around the rocket on the launcher to keep it warm. And so I walked in there in August of 1971, and they had the mock-up already started. By the winter of 72, we had 2 or 3 of these things working very well. And so We had a $1 million input of money to improve poker, add more launchers, build a payload assembly building. So Eldon says, we'll just use dynamite and take that big building down, because we'll set off the charges of dynamite so it just gently pooches all the plywood out and it falls to the ground. We'll have 100% recovery of materials. Well, I think as you read in the book that Neal wrote, more like 85%, but it still wasn't bad.
It wasn't bad.
It was really amazing.
But who says being a rocket science isn't fun? You know, I mean, that must have been a hoot. But something you just said also brings to mind. We're for the day. This is huge budgets that you guys are playing around with. Right?
I started out with a budget of $400,000 at poker. I had only ever handled $80,000 prior to taking that on, and that first year of the $400,000 was the first time. That's why they hired me as a full-time person. Was the first time we had an idea of where the money was and how we would be able to use it. Mind you, we had to launch the rockets before we got paid. So we could do all the preparation, but you didn't get paid until the rocket went off the ground. So we charged $32,000 to NASA to launch a rocket, and we charged $5,000 to the National Science Foundation, until the government auditors caught up with us and said, you can't do that. You got to tell the government the same price for everything. They still let us get away with it for a little bit, but we had this build it ourselves attitude, and not only did we get $1 million in the summer of '72, before I'd even completed my first year there, we got another $1 million the next year. Each year we were doubling the capacity of poker. We ended up in just a few months' time by '72 of 21 major launches a year, and a meteorological rocket 3 times a week. Just amazing expansion. We had, when I walked in August of '71, we were putting in the incoherent scatter radar right next to poker to prove that the radar could do the same thing as rockets could do. And big question, could it? It did. We also have brought a program of 3 times each week meteorological rocket launches from Fort Greely, Alaska to Poker Flat. Those were used to try to study what the weather is above the Weather Bureau balloon altitudes. So you go to 100,000 feet with a balloon, you go to 250,000 feet with a rocket that puts out a parachute. As it falls back to the ground, carries radar reflective parachute. You track the chute to get the wind speeds and directions. Hanging below is a little temperature sensor, radioed the data to the ground. Overlap from 100,000 to 80,000 between the balloon and the rocket. And wow, these things were just off the wall, really happening fast.
Hundreds of launches in your time as director.
Yeah, I had 200, and I think I clocked out at 219 launches, which I think I pushed the button on 2. Carol Koch said, I know you really want to do this, Neal.
Oh, I totally, yeah, that's my job. I want to push that button.
But, and then the Met rockets, they lasted, we ran those from 1972 through 1978 before that program outlived its usefulness, because they started building satellites orbiting the Earth that could do what these little rockets could do, and they could cover the whole Earth rather than, we were one of 3 Army supported ranges, one here, one at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, one at Fort Sherman in the Panama Canal Zone. So those 3 amongst the 30 worldwide internationally cooperative above the balloon altitude weather stations. That's what we did. Great fun.
Well, when you eventually retired from Poker Flat, you interestingly went on a sabbatical, your first sabbatical in, I don't know, what, 20 or more years, and found a passion for education. Explain that to me.
I think I always did better with kids than I did with adults. I just found it easier to communicate, and during that time I was working to try to re-enter the field of the study of noctilucent clouds, which I had a background in and I had studied. And I wanted to get back into that. And I had said when I took the job at poker, no more than 3 years, because I'll be so out of it, I won't be able to return. Nevertheless, I tried to do that, and I had a lot of support from a Rocketeer who'd been at poker a lot, Charlie Barth from the University of Colorado. He said, come on down. So I spent a fall and spring semester at the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics in Boulder, Colorado. Great time. But there I got interested through some New York Times science articles. Like once a week, there's a whole page dedicated in the New York Times. And there was one talking about the middle school science problem. The gist of it was, through the 4th grade, anything that kids make and bring home to their parents, like gluing macaroni on the outside of a glass jar and painting it, the parents go, ooh, that's the best I've ever seen, you know. But then when you start to challenge kids to think and interpret data for what they're doing, they start to lose interest in science, and usually they have no science classes, hardly any science classes in middle school. In high school, you know, rare is a student who goes physics or chemistry. They get some general science class and maybe a biology class. That'd be about it in high school. So we set out to try to change that, and our target were middle school teachers. And I got into that with Emma Walton, who headed up the Anchorage School District science curriculum. And she had hands-on science, and I was interested in hands-on science. And we got together and we started working with teachers, middle school teachers who were scared to death to have a computer in the classroom because the kids could use it better than they could. And we were just trying to get them to get used to it, you know, not to put grades on it, just put attendance on it and things like that. So it did work. Led to me eventually, after I retired from poker, to starting the Alaska Space Academy for middle school students, for teachers as well as students. So we had about 100 students broken up into groups of 10, teams of co-educational boys and girls, high school students as mentors to the middle school students, college students mentoring the high school students, and I was the one science guy. But we pretended we went to an unknown world.
Yeah, that sounds so cool. This is at Lost Lake?
Lost Lake. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea was we were going out there with advanced knowledge that the team that had done the exploration had not survived the mission. They had sent back data, but we didn't know why they had gone bad. So we were out there with no knowledge of this other world. We didn't know what the plants were. We didn't know what the trees were. We didn't know what the fish were in the water. We were going to investigate them and see if we could make up our own categories and figure that. But we knew that the problem was that the radiation level was so high you had to build a house a meter under the water, which we did. We had all the kids build a habitat under the water, which they scuba dived down into and stuck their head up into and came back out again. It was just a barrel, 55-gallon plastic barrel upside down, yeah, weighted down with concrete.
Not according to imagination.
Not according to imagination. Had a wonderful time. Had the kids, the Boy Scout group at Lost Lake was fantastic. So we had the kids split up into teams of 10. Some of them went out on the lake with fish finders in kind of an assigned area, each team taking a different part of the lake, mapped the bottom. The team on shore had to figure out how to tell where they were out there with kind of triangulation from shore. And I remember after we got the map of the bottom of the lake, not everybody agreed with everybody, and the kids wanted to know, what do we do now? And I kept telling the teachers and the kids, go do it again, anytime, you know. This is what we're here for. We're here to learn. You don't have to, you don't have just 40 minutes in the class and 10 minutes to get to the other class. We'll take more time and learn these things. We had built model rockets and then took them all out to Poker Flat and launched rockets out there. One of my favorites was we took one of these big solid satellite dishes, about 8-9 feet in diameter, and at Lost Lake there's a huge area that's about 4 feet down to the underwater, and it extends about a quarter of the lake up there is in that fashion. So we put this dish down in the water. And we said, we had this mission, delivered supplies, it landed out there, you got to go find it and bring it back to shore because we need those supplies. Of course, there was nothing in it. But anyway, the kids went out and they struggled trying to lift this solid dish against all the water that kept them from moving. And then somebody thought about, well, turn it on edge and just roll it out. I love that. So we kept the kids from seeing how other kids solved the problem, but we always said there's more than one way to solve any problem. Mathematics and so on and so forth. You need to play around with these, and it's okay.
It's so interesting hearing that scenario because, of course, a very popular book, The Martian, really capitalizes on this can-do attitude and surviving. And is that a key component that you've aimed for, Neal? Is this idea about curiosity and trying whatever works?
Yeah. My basic skill, I think, is an incredible curiosity and then enthusiasm. And I try to bring that across, particularly to people I'm talking with or with kids, to get them interested. And usually if you're really excited about something, everybody wants to help you. If you go around grumpy and complaining, people don't tend to come in and try to help you solve the problem. But when you're really upbeat around it, they're saying, oh, what can I do to help? Well, I don't know, but I can't figure out how to do this. And then they chime in, and pretty soon you figure something out with more than your ideas to begin with to solve a problem. And sometimes it's just, how do I, in this classroom, get these kids interested? And usually, not all of them get it, but they talk to one another. Pretty soon they're getting get it because they're challenged to be a group of people solving a problem. And I'm going, yeah, fine, good with me.
Well, even when you stopped working, let's say, directly with the space camp and you relinquished being the space grant director, you continued to teach, I think, about Ollie and about that. And why this passion for teaching? Why this passion for communication?
It's something that has occurred relatively late in my life. I'm 79 right now. I think probably I realized finally when I was in my early 70s that I really enjoy teaching. I did obviously do it, and I think I did it well, but I wasn't thinking about that. I was balancing many balls in the air. Once I retired, one of the elements that I often identified is that now that I'm retired, instead of trying to do everything and not take enough time to get it done right and to done it in a way I really feel good about it, now I can really concentrate on it and do things well, and I'll be a lot more happy with it. Somehow in the long run here, I've come to this great feeling, and I enjoy teaching. We innovatively built a class here at the Geophysical Institute and took it to lower campus because we were missing students on lower campus. Never came up here to take any classes.
Because they were more liberal arts based, right?
Yeah, and that's way up there. And nobody went down there to talk to them and tell them about all this cool research at the university, biology and everything. So we started this class. We jokingly call it a playful romp in our solar system. It was an introductory
tiny little thing
astronomy
that it is.
class about our world here, but finding examples like the volcanoes on Mars, the volcanoes on Earth, the permafrost on Mars, the permafrost on Earth. all these analogies, the craters on Earth, the craters on Moon and other places, all sorts of things. And we were very successful with it. So 2 or 3 years of doing that, getting a lot of positive feedback, I ended up then doing exactly the same thing with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute program, where we create classes for people 50 years of age and older that live in Fairbanks, kind of like a staycation. You don't have to go anywhere. People pay a super minimal price to take these classes. A typical class might be 4 Fridays for part of the morning on 4 Fridays a month, and that's it for a month. And I just took that and adapted it. What I found, of course, was that a lot of these people that were in that class, again, their science was 6th grade to 8th grade. They had never gone to high school and taken it. But now they had a whole life full of experiences, and we live in this technical world where everything's technology around us in every which way, and you live with it. Infrared controls for the TV and the lights and God only knows why. So when I got into those OLLI classes, I could take those analogies and treat them to people that were 50 years old and be right on target, and I get a lot of positive feedback from it. Taking a mini drone, a $200 drone, and starting my OLLI class on unmanned aerial vehicles, which I used the information from the university about peaceful, non-violent uses, checking on animals and game and all that. But I had that on the floor, I punched the button, up it rose about waist high, and everyone in the audience looked at it and they were having a great fun with it. And I raised it a little higher, and suddenly they realized that the video camera on that drone was looking right at them, and it was portraying on the screen right behind me. So,
Surveillance, great.
big round of applause, like this is cool stuff. So, I've always looked for a gimmick. How can you grab the attention of someone and get them interested in what you're doing and why? So, yeah.
I want to acknowledge that your many responsibilities kept you from getting your doctorate here until your work in science education got you an honorary PhD. Tell me about that.
Well, I had decided with 2 children born and 1 on the way for the 3rd that I just couldn't handle the PhD program, and so I pulled out of it. And I think that Neal Davis and Keith Mather gave me the chance to do that and help stay here, probably in the hopes that I'd go back to it, but I didn't.
You think, being director of Poker Flat and of the Space Grant Program, you think?
And then, but I really got wrapped up in this science education area in my sabbatical in the 1989 fall and the spring. And I really, really enjoyed that. I really worked hard at it. Done the space camp in 93, 94, which was open to students in the Yukon Territory, Alaska, and even from Russia. We had students come in. It was really worked well. About 300 students over 3 weeks in 93, several more in the summer of 94, and we held a camp down in Palmer, Alaska. So I was really enjoying doing these things. I lose about 15 pounds a week.
So a new diet, I think, is...
Well, it was good food and all, but it was really, really stressful. But anyway, so the outcome was that I left, and I just didn't think about honorary doctorate or anything like that. It was my son, Chris, who, my oldest son, who started stirring the pot, talking to Karen Sedso here, who was high-ranking in the university public relations department and others. It seemed to catch on, such that there were 3 honorary PhDs brought about that year in 1997. My whole family was able to hear. They came back to Alaska to be a part of it. My neighbor, Mike Kelly, was on the Board of Regents, and he put the sash over my head, and he lived right next door to me here in Fairbanks. So
How
pretty
exciting.
cool time. I
Didn't see it coming, huh?
no, I didn't. I had no idea that. I'd gotten one of these little papers from the document from the state of Alaska legislature commemorating me on my work in science education, but then this was a level further about that with the honorary PhD.
Well, not many years ago, I think 2016, you received the Roger Smith Lifetime Achievement Award
Right.
from the Geophysical Institute.
Yeah, another complete, did not see that coming at all, in that Carl Benson, Neal Davis, both very accomplished people, hundreds of publications, and many, many different ways that they've served the university and been a huge part of the community of Alaska. And all of a sudden they're calling up and say, we've got this award, we'd like to give it to you. I'm going like, really? I want to be on the same footing as Neal Davis and Carl Benson. That was a total surprise.
Well, I can't leave this conversation and this list of accomplishments. You're the only guy I've ever interviewed to have a road named after him at Poker Flat. Tell me about the Neal Brown Road.
The Fairbanks North Star Borough decided to get involved with the so-called 911 system. And that meant that all of the multiple beaver lanes, Moose Track Road, and all that, there were too many complicated roads around here that everybody had to figure out just one road for the borough to know how to get an ambulance or help to. That came up. Mary Farrell had worked for me at Poker when I retired in 1989. Quietly went around and got everybody out there to pitch in, tell the Fairbanks North Star Borough and not the university that they wanted that called Neal Brown Road. At the end of June of when I retired in 1989, we had a big picnic, a big party at Poker. We used to have picnic parties out there almost every year. The Geophysical Business Office and the Poker crew got together, and everybody came out from the Institute, had a great time. Turn in off the Steese Highway, and there's a road sign that says Neal Brown Road, and it's still there.
Yeah.
Nobody
How many
shot
bullet
it yet.
holes? Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna
nobody
say.
shot it yet. I hope
How
that-
un-Alaskan is that?
So it was, again, a complete surprise. Mary Farrell told me later that she thought, whoever comes along next as the director, they might get grandiose ideas about naming it after themselves. So we ought to do it for ourselves. Apparently, the university never said it had any comment about it at all, one way or the other.
Well, I'm sure
so,
not.
It's kind of fun.
Well deserved, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. Neal Brown, what a pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you, Robert. It's
Yeah.
always a pleasure to see and encounter you and talk with you about things we both find interesting.
A wonderful interview, Robert, great too. But the little snippet with the drone caught my attention. I was out walking in my neighborhood, which is out east end of town, and all of a sudden I heard this, I go, oh my gosh, and I looked up and there was this drone over the street, and I'm not in the woods, and
Yeah.
I was surprised to see this drone go zipping by. Obviously, you've had a lot of experience with technology over your career, and drones are a new thing that are just starting to come up. What is your opinion about drones in our society and their ability for artificial intelligence and surveillance?
How many times today do you think you've been seen on a video camera? It's just an amazing number. And the surveillance that happens, and that was part of what I tried to talk about with the Ollie class. It was not only that they can be used to, you know, somewhat covertly, using an infrared camera, spot seals on a harbor rock that you can't find any other way. If you go near them, they'll jump into the water and get away from you. But one of the things I tried to bring to that class was say, yeah, you go in every grocery store, you see video cameras on the streets as you drive by. There's just an enormous amount of information that's being gathered on you. What do you think about that? It bothers me a little bit, but I didn't get a lot of feedback out of the people in the audience. I seemed to know it was happening, but they didn't see it as a problem. Each time I read about how in China, when someone walks into the country, they take your picture and have it so on there. And it's like they can find you within 45 seconds wherever you are. You could be anywhere in China, and they've got enough cameras around in the most god-awful places, they can find you. That is kind of going past the edge for me. So, but for the peaceful uses, there's just an amazing number of great things you can do, and the technology has morphed. This little Parrot drone that cost $200 that I brought into the classroom. Now I have one that's a little more expensive, but it's just bulletproof. It will, no matter what the wind is doing, it will go straight up in the air and take pictures back down. I can control it to look this way and that. I find it fascinating. I don't want to get into any business. There's lots of commercial businesses and ways you can do this, but I think they're a lot of fun. And there are so many of them out there now. You had one, hopefully it wasn't tracking you and following you, but they're just all over the place. They've become inexpensive, and I'm not sure it's a great idea that, because not everybody is responsible in how they do it, you know, how they use it. So, anyway.
If they could only tell me where I parked the car in the parking lot, that would be very useful. Anyone else with some questions?
Hey, Neal.
Hi.
I would like to know, when you take those long walks with your dog every day, what are you thinking of?
We were at a party last night where they got out a guitar and people were singing songs. And it sort of was a lot of fun. It was just a small group of people, and we were pretty amateurs about it. We had a good time. You are my sunshine, you are my sunshine. And those simple things. This morning, as Molly and I, my little dog, were walking up the road, there were a dozen little robins that kept bouncing along the road, flying up into the trees and back down again. And so I put on my Facebook page today the song, When the Robins Bobbing Along, and that's what we thought about all the way back up to the house. And I came in the house, I immediately went to YouTube, and I found it, and I planted it on my Facebook to say, this started my day. It was a great day. Yeah. Robin thought it was one of her favorite songs too. Yeah.
You know, you're very active on Facebook and other social media. Do you think that's an important vehicle for communicating a passion for science or curiosity?
I don't purposely, I don't necessarily want people to follow me, or my mission is not to get more people interested in much of anything, but I do have, there must be something going on in here that I really enjoy it. I like to put things up, and it's a broad range of curiosities. So it's not any one thing. There's a number of people in the audience here tonight that are just super photographers, and I enjoy what they put up, and then I put up my own little thing every once in a while, kind of humorous sometimes, but it's a wide range of topics. But like I say, I'm not out there I'm not making any money at it. I know how to spend money really well, but I'm not too good at bringing it in. So I have a Vimeo, V-I-M-E-O, website that I use. I have a Smug Mug account that I put things up on. We had a reunion of a number of people from the Geophysical Institute over the last Saturday. About 93 people showed up that still live here in Fairbanks, no longer working at the Institute. A few people did show up that do work at the Institute. And we had a really great time, and we ran, took a lot of pictures and put them all up on Smug Mug. And so people that couldn't make it really enjoyed looking at it, and they had a good time with it. So yeah, I think the social media sorts of things can be really neat to do. I don't do a great job of checking in on these to look for what people put up, but anyway, yeah.
Neal, I just want to say you've done great things for young people in this community, and the multitude of camps that we now have and the choices that students have in terms of science
Yeah.
camps, academies, institutes, is just wonderful. However, you know, much of that takes place out of our traditional educational system.
Yeah.
That is, we have this kind of, it's not a bureaucracy, in some ways it is, but it's a system. And it operates the way it has operated for many, many years.
Yeah.
It's based on seat time, it's based on credit, it's based on testing, knowledge regurgitation to a great degree. And now things are changing. We're getting more choices in this community through charter schools and so forth. But I'd just like to know your thoughts about how do you get inside that system? How do you change that system if it needs changing? How do you do that?
It's really tough. I've been involved in a number of projects where, and the question is for the whole audience, the question is how do you get involved into that system of school, K through 12, that exists today? How do you, it's a really, a lot's going on there. A lot has to happen there. And yet you come along with these ideas on the habitat camp and space camp and other things. How do you maybe get them in? You almost can't. It just doesn't work. Wish it did. I've tried various ways. I've participated in a number of teacher in services and presented for them. I think the crowning jewel in my hat was in 1988 when the Alaska AAAS meeting was here in Fairbanks. We had about 400 scientists that all came from Canada, the Yukon Territory. We all came in here, but I had the chance to work with a school district, and we had 1,300 school teachers all came to that one same conference, and we had them there for a couple, 3 days, and it was just marvelous. There was a lot of great exchanges took place. The scientists got a better sense of the classrooms, and the teachers, they watched two really strong personalities duke it out on stage. One was the absolute pure physicist. You must not deviate from teaching everything perfectly. And the other guy was saying, you can't get people interested unless you don't water it down a little bit. Boy, they duked it out, and the audience in Herring Auditorium was full, and it was a sight to see and watch what was happening. It was really, really cool. But it's really hard to find a way to get into the schools and do that. I think that the teacher in services are one of the possibilities. I looked at the space camp as a chance to try to get teachers and kids both to break out of that idea that you only have 40 minutes and then you have 10 minutes to get to the next class. So it worked for a couple, 3 years, but I don't know if I made a dent in anything in the long run.
May I remind you that you recently did rockets with a gifted and talented group at George School?
Yeah, I did have, I swore I wasn't going to do that again. I must have made hundreds and hundreds of model rockets, both during my career at the university and then helping other university groups do this. And then this Melanie Hinsman, wife of Larry Hinsman, I didn't know that at the time who she was. She was just a school teacher who'd been left a stack of rocket motors and tubes and one thing and another, and she's going to retire, and she cried a lot when I help her teach this class. And so as my wife, Fran, just told the story, I went down to and spent time with a group at Joy Elementary School, sort of a gifted and talented, 14 really dedicated kids. And through the good graces of Kathy Rich and Poker Flat Research Range under the Geophysical Institute, we went out there and launched their rockets at Poker, which is a huge event for them. They really had a great time. So I don't know, how many kids from Galena did we bring in here and build model rockets for? And Gary and Ned Roselle and Gary Cooper, and you know, we've done all these things through the years. It's been really marvelous. But anyway, fun. Yes.
And you have affected teachers.
And I'm sorry, I can't.
You have affected teachers, because I'm one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, yeah, hopefully. Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, you can probably badger them out at the reception out in the foyer. Neal Brown, thank you.
Thank you. I'll say in final summary, this is it's a great honor for me to be here tonight. It's really a tribute to people who've helped me do things, people who've had great ideas that I wanted to join into. One of the most significant for me is when I proposed marriage to my wife, Fran, and she accepted. So, going on 38 years, and a lot of that time has been what you've seen here tonight on the screen.
How many years again?
38 this year, 38. Yeah.